lot for the kind invitation. I apologize, I was speaking English to you. So, Forum Future has asked me to speak about active citizenship. And what can I say about that? I'm interested in democracy and how democracy comes about. I don't need to kind of, explain to Bulgarians what is kind of, the notion of transition towards democracy when a country becomes a democracy. And so the kind of question which I would like to address is the role of citizens when creating democracy. And I will address the myth that democracy is created by its citizens. At this point, I would have expected kind of, first eggs and tomatoes thrown at me, because some of you kind of will know ancient Greek, and they will know that kind of demos is the people, kind of, the community of citizens, and democracy is the rule by the citizens and the rule for the citizens. So how does somebody kind of, dare to stand in front of you and kind of speak of a myth that democracy is created by the citizens? I hope to kind of, that I can use this short talk to nuance our understanding about kind of the role of citizens in democracy. I will kind of, try to make the argument using several examples. You are equally familiar with, probably I guess as me, kind of having a look at Egypt in 2011, having a look at Poland in the 1980s, having a look at neighboring Serbia in 2000, and having a look at this year's event in Romania. I will try to make the argument that actually stable democracies are not necessarily kind of built by their citizens. I will speak about rebellions by citizens living under authoritarian regimes. And I will kind of, tell that these rebellions, they can lead to civil wars, they can produce new dictatorships, but they rarely kind of lead to democracy. And rather, if we look at kind of, if we make a historical analysis, we'll figure out that organized movements with very responsible kind of elite actors can reach agreements for political transition. And we will reach the conclusion that an active civil society is an effective safeguard of democracy. But we will probably also come to the conclusion that it's a little bit biased towards the rich and the powerful in a not very democratic way. But let me start kind of, the history going 6 years back to the Arab world. And our hearts were kind of, if we look at the kind of happenings in 2010-11, our hearts were filled with hope. We were seeing kind of, as I guess many of you, as myself, the pictures from a Tunisian town we didn't know before, Sidi Bouzid, which got famous because we had a protests kind of, emerging over some kind of local grievances, which were about kind of corruption, mismanagement. We had this kind of local merchant who got famous, who felt treated unjustly by the authorities, who self-immolated himself, and which sparked kind of, protests locally, which quickly kind of grew over to the entire country of Tunisia. And very soon, weeks after, we saw actually the whole Middle East burning. Kind of, this is a picture from Tahrir Square in Cairo. And this was something which was kind of, a lot of important kind of, knowledgeable, intelligent people all around the world were astonished, very positively surprised. We had the impression that it's impossible to kind of, to bring democracy, to bring liberal values to the Middle East. People were believing that this is a kind of a region which is immune to kind of, to democracy. And some important voices even kind of were arguing that Islam as a religion is not compatible with democracy as such. And now we saw kind of as this impulse from a kind of small Tunisian town, we have a wave of kind of protests taking to the streets all across kind of, the Middle East, in particular in Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and Libya. And we saw people kind of, are affected. They have kind of, a goal of establishing liberal values, a liberal kind of society, liberal democracies in a region where we believe this is not possible. they saw that kind of, the regime in Tunisia was very quickly overthrown, and people felt they are in a very similar situation. They are also kind of facing injustices, kind of, massive corruption. They are facing massive youth unemployment, and they saw it's possible to kind of bring about change. And so we saw a process which was very much bottom-up. There were no organized kind of, there was not a well-organized civil society. There wasn't a tradition of protests. There were no organizations leading it. It was a kind of very much bottom-up mobilization, triggered by the pictures which people saw on Al Jazeera television to take the protests. If we look at the kind of example of Cairo, which I have here on my picture, people were assembling after Friday prayers in front of the mosques in their kind of local neighborhood and jointly kind of marched from the different outskirts of town to Tahrir Square in the city center, and very quickly managed to kind of topple the authoritarian regime by Mubarak. People kind of, were dreaming when they were sleeping about a liberal world they would be living in, kind of, joining the liberal part of the world in this region where we would have thought it would be impossible. And when they woke up, the Arab Spring was over, and they woke up in new kind of authoritarian regimes. The outcome was an Islamic victory first in Egypt, and then a military coup which was bringing about an even kind of more repressive regime than we had before. It was repression and civil war, which is still going on in some of the countries, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, and Libya. What happened? To come back to the Egyptian example, after the old regime was toppled, kind of, semi-free, fraudulent elections were organized. And who was the one who was having an organizational capacity of mobilizing kind of voters to the polls? There wasn't an organizational background of the kind of liberal part of Egypt. They were disorganized. Whereas we had the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic movement, which had kind of, this grassroots organization with local branches, which was acting as a kind of, socially active charity. And they were kind of, taking home then the election victory with a kind of, not a democratic, not a liberal, but an anti kind of, liberal policy. And what happened is that the new government by the Muslim Brotherhood was in fierce contrast, kind of, in conflict to the Western-oriented militaries who were still a very strong power. And inevitably the outcome was a military coup, and the hopes were very kind of quickly over, not only for Egypt, but also for the rest of the region, with very few exceptions. It's not a unique example of, and there might be some people who are very aware about kind of history and might have thought, oh, this kind of, pattern of transnational protests, this reminds me of Europe of 1848, a year which was very important in terms of kind of, the liberal movement, the kind of, creation of kind of, transnational liberalism in Europe. A movement which was sparked by the very short-living revolution in Paris, which was the center of Europe and the world at this time, and spilled over as far as Cracovia in Prussia, then at these times now Poland, Palermo in Sicily, Iași and Bucharest in what used to be Wallachia and Moldavia. It was as little consequential as the Arab Spring, very much bottom-up, very much kind of, triggered by the reports which were coming in from Paris, but with not a good kind of strong organizational background. Now this is the bad part of kind of, the bad news which I have for citizen mobilization. Let's move to more successful examples, also to see kind of, what the differences are between the different kind of, episodes of mobilization. Another kind of wave of mobilization, which I am confident that you are very well familiar with it, was happening in the 1980s. And the person who you see here on the picture is Lech Walesa, who became the leader of the Solidarność movement in Poland in the 1980s. Solidarność was born from kind of a wave of labor protests, strikes, So kind of, you know, from trade union activism in Poland in the early 1980s, which was where kind of, you know, we had the workers, industry workers being kind of opposed to the oppressive communist regime. The kind of conflict stalled for some time, but then kind of, you know, grew again towards the end of the 1980s. And in 1988, analysts who looked closely at kind of, you know, the conflict which we had, saw a kind of massive kind of new mobilization of whole society kind of on the street against the Communist Party. But at the same time, they are speaking of a two-level conflict. So on the one hand, we had kind of in Poland a situation where we did have kind of, you know, this conflict of the mobilized society in the streets against kind of the oppressive communist regime. But on the other hand, we also had a conflict which was growing within the Solidarność movement, within the opposition between kind of the moderate leadership around Lech Walesa and kind of much more radical people who were standing in the streets. And we had a conflict within the Communist Party between what we call hardliners who didn't want to negotiate at all prices, and moderates who were more willing to kind of, you know, to search for a solution. A very dangerous situation. At this point, kind of hardly anybody expected that the outcome would be democracy in Poland. People were more afraid of a coup, of an intervention by the Soviet Union, maybe even kind of a civil war. But this is not what happened. And the kind of the key event for the transition towards democracy in Poland was this roundtable, which was taking place in early '89 in what is today the presidential palace of Poland. We had a roundtable between kind of the responsible forces on both sides, so kind of the opposition leaders and of Solidarność, the moderates, and the moderates from the regime were sitting together, and they came to the conclusion that there needs to be some political change, there needs to be some political liberalization. Liberalization didn't mean that we move from today to tomorrow to a democracy, but we negotiate kind of, you know, some careful, slow steps of transition. Let's hold first kind of semi-free election only for a part of the seats in the Polish parliament, and let's legalize Solidarność as a movement. That was the conclusion which was taken at the roundtable. And what was happening afterwards is just kind of, you know, the process went much faster and essentially kind of very quickly toppled the regime. And Poland used to be kind of, you know, one of the fastest countries in the Eastern Bloc to introduce democracy and used to be considered a stable one. Maybe today people wouldn't be so convinced anymore of this conclusion. It wasn't only Poland, you know that kind of protests have spread all over the region, GDR, Czechoslovakia, kind of Hungary, so the kind of, you know, the Iron Curtain falling, and in the end we have also kind of the Zhivkov regime in Bulgaria, Nicolae Ceausescu, who were overthrown, among other kind of, you know, by popular mobilization, and the Soviet Union collapsing. The lessons which we can learn from the case is that actually kind of sustainable, successful democracy is built not only on the streets, but much more behind closed doors, in kind of negotiations between the responsible leaders who can kind of, you know, join the old alliances in support of democracy and kind of evit chaos, demagogy, and kind of, you know, the threat of future coups and unrest. One of the countries which was still kind of left out of the process was Serbia, where in 1989, while we saw kind of, you know, political transition starting all around kind of the Eastern Bloc, at the same time Slobodan Milosevic, the kind of party secretary, was going to Kosovo Polje, where he was holding his kind of famous speech, which is considered today as kind of, you know, the sparking element for Serbian nationalism, which has led us then kind of, you know, to wars when Serbia attacked neighboring Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and has fought the war against its Albanian minority in Kosovo until NATO intervention in 1999, when Serbia eventually kind of has lost the wars. And when we saw kind of, which was also kind of, you know, the year when we saw, once again, there were several kind of, you know, citizen movements before, the citizen movement growing, a very professional one. Maybe some of you have been to Novi Sad, to the Exit Festival, or you have at least kind of heard of it, but it's still today kind of, you know, I would guess the most important, most prominent kind of rock festival in the region on the Petrovaradin fortress. The Exit Festival takes kind of, you know, started exactly in this kind of crucial period at the end of the 20th century when we saw this organized opposition kind of growing in Serbia. It was a festival which was organized kind of, you know, among the opposition youth in Serbia, which had a lot of kind of political meaning, was eventually kind of also aimed at kind of, you know, forming a youth movement against the government. With also kind of a lot of Western support. The Exit Festival is only kind of one symbolic part. We had, in preparation of the presidential election in September 2000, we had a kind of, you know, an important kind of Western also supported, very professional organization of a movement for change in Serbia, the Otpor movement, which was kind of seconded by a united opposition, kind of, you know, in favor of one single kind of presidential candidate in the election, and which was mobilizing kind of society in Serbia before the election. Now, one of the big concerns would be that maybe kind of, you know, the opposition could take home the majority of the votes. But we knew about the nature of elections in Serbia, which were not exactly kind of always free of manipulation, to say so. And so kind of, you know, one of the big fears was that the opposition might actually kind of gain the majority of votes in elections. But Milosevic would kind of claim the victory on his own and kind of keep governing. How could this be prevented? Again, we had kind of, you know, a very professional campaign, and one key element of this campaign were exit polls which were conducted on the election day all over kind of Serbia, election observations, but the exit polls, you know, kind of people are asked as they exit the polling stations what they actually voted, and then it's calculated. And what was key is that at 8 o'clock in the evening on election day, so at the moment when the doors of the polling station closed, we, the opposition, had a first kind of, you know, projection of the election result. And the opposition, before the kind of electoral commission controlled by the Socialist Party of Milosevic could kind of, you know, claim that they have won the election, the opposition was already there. And the opposition, through kind of independent media, could project their own kind of, you know, results, which was widely kind of received all over Serbia. What was the key strategy? It was a kind of well-orchestrated model planned from above to kind of undermine the legitimacy of the regime at a kind of crucial moment, taking the elections as a window of opportunity to kind of, you know, signal that Milosevic has lost kind of, you know, the legitimacy. And through kind of a professional campaign undermining kind of, you know, then also his legitimacy and his possibility to falsify kind of, you know, the election result. Now, Milosevic claimed later on, after we had already kind of the exit polls which established the first truth, that he had won the elections. And the result was that very few days later, based on all these preparations, we saw the 5th of October 2000, a huge kind of, you know, protest movement taking to Belgrade, taking on the square in front of the parliament. Hundreds of thousands or even kind of millions of Serbs flow from all parts of the country kind of coming into Belgrade, which led eventually kind of to this bulldozer revolution when kind of Milosevic was kicked out from office, and 1 year later he was extradited to the International Court for War Crimes in The Hague. So the key for this kind of, you know, social mobilization, as I would like to highlight it, is not only about kind of the citizens being there, but a professional kind of, you know, preparation of the events. A model which was afterwards also exported and became kind of, you know, known as the colored revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, and in Kyrgyzstan. So the kind of, preliminary kind of lessons learned from that would be that there are many instances of kind of, transnational waves of citizens taken to the streets against kind of, dictatorships, against kind of the economic and other grievances which they feel in authoritarian regimes. Sometimes rebellions can bring down an authoritarian regime, but usually a rebellion alone is not enough to build democracy. Democracies are also built kind of on organized elites, on pacts between kind of old and new elites. But what about the role of citizens then in democracies? Well, needless to say, kind of citizens have a say through elections. Citizens have a say through kind of institutionalized kind of patterns, such as petitions which they can file. In some countries there are possibilities to kind of exert their kind of, view in referendums. But what about kind of, other ways of holding governments accountable between elections? Now there is kind of one important argument that civil society is extremely important to kind of stop bad governments. And I would like to have a last look at Romania in the beginning of this year. Romania has experienced the largest protests which were ever seen, kind of the largest mobilization which were ever seen in the history of the country. The issue was the kind of citizens in Romania already suffer and feel kind of they live under an extremely corrupted kind of, government. There were many scandals, and the last kind of, the last trigger which happened kind of, early this year was the Romanian government wanted to pass a bill which would essentially have depenalized even high-level corruption. So kind of, getting a free pass to kind of, corruption and free pass from prosecution. And this has led to kind of, massive citizen mobilization. And eventually kind of, the Romanian kind of government needed to withdraw this particular bill. So there was kind of, at least preliminary, there was kind of some success to citizen mobilization. I would like to see more of that, and I would like to see kind of what is happening in the subsequent elections. Unfortunately, they are only taking part in Romania in 3 or 4 years. It's not clear yet when exactly, and somehow I think I'm not the only person in this room who has the vague feelings that many people might have forgotten by then about this corruption bill, and for some other reasons kind of, confirm a similar set of elites in political power. So citizens do have kind of, as civil society, as mobilization, the possibility to control their governments, to hold the governments kind of, accountable, to be a safeguard against kind of the abuse of power, for instance, for corruption. But the space is very limited, and one aspect which we should also be very well aware is kind of reflecting who are these citizens who are being active. Well, usually it's the students. It's people who are kind of at the better, who are better off in society, or other kind of, we have a bias towards the more educated, the kind of richer part of society who are active in civil society. So we could ask the question whether this is a very democratic channel. Let me wrap up. We were starting about the question, what is the role of citizens in democracy, and what do democracies kind of, have to do with citizens? Well, clearly kind of, we know that democracy is the rule for the citizens. Democracy as a regime protects kind of, I'm using the term regime in the sense of a system kind of, democracy, if we live in a democracy, democracies tend to protect the freedoms and liberties of citizens, we know that. We know that democracies protect their citizens from war and other types of political violence. And we know that democracies are a very important safeguard against kind of unfair distribution, against kind of, the masses needing to kind of, to pay for authoritarian elites. We know that sometimes, for instance, in election periods, democratic rule is controlled by the citizens, sometimes even kind of, through citizen activism. But what we also need to conclude, kind of to end with this myth that democracy is built by the citizens, democracies themselves are usually built by the elites and were very early the fruit of mobilized citizens. If you want to read more on these thoughts, many of the stories and the pictures I've taken from this book to which I've contributed, but now, after I hope I have been able to provoke you, I'm looking forward to the discussion with you now and later on also in the break. Thanks a lot.